of the life and the teachings of Jesus written by men. And these men, as they claim, were witnesses to the events, but because they witnessed them from different angles and from different viewpoints, they wrote down different accounts. Although I would still not be very satisfied with that, it would still be a good start, because we would have to say then, well, that's exactly what we're saying. You can't claim then that the Gospels are the Word of God. The Gospels are actually the accounts of human beings with mistakes and with contradictions who looked at things from a different angle. So you can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it. You can't keep the cake looking there all nice and pretty and eat it at the same time. You can't have the Bible being the Word of God and the accounts of men. It's either the accounts written by men who made mistakes and looked at things from different angles, or the Word of God. You can't have both. It's one or the other. Of course, Christians then try to get round that by actually redefining what they mean by the Word of God. Then they start redefining it and saying, no, it's not actually the Word of God, like the Ten Commandments, actually they're inscribed in stone. No, this is something that God moved men to write. So it was sort of inspired, that God sort of motivated them and moved them and sort of, maybe the Spirit came down and sort of motivated them to write down these things. But you see the danger. From being motivated to write down something, and that motivation came from God, is very, very far from it being the Word of God. So this is our first problem. There is no truth at all in the claim that the Bible is the Word of God. That cannot be substantiated. It cannot be proven. It's not a position that can be held. And if it's not the Word of God, and it is the accounts of human beings, then surely we have to realize that that is open to some serious type of questioning. We want to know how valid these accounts are. How accurate are they? How truly do they represent a picture of what went on? And here's another problem, is that many Christians would like to imagine and would like us to believe that the gospel is a factual, or the gospels are factual accounts of something that really happened and things that Jesus really said and really did. And now I want to question this as well. I want to question this. First of all, there is internal evidence within the Gospels and within the New Testament itself that what the Gospel writers did was write down accounts of what they thought and what they imagined was beneficial. They selected statements of Jesus. And they selected events that they imagined or that they thought had taken place in the life of Jesus, and they selected it according to what they believed was appropriate. But these gospel writers themselves admit that there are many teachings of Jesus, and many accounts have been written of the life of Jesus. They have selected what they deemed was appropriate. Now, that sort of makes one curious. I wonder what the other accounts of the life of Jesus and the sayings of Jesus said. That means that there were other people writing other books, writing other gospels, writing other accounts of the life of Jesus that they felt appropriate, that they felt was appropriate and they felt was correct. Now that begs the question, well, how do we know the ones that we've got are the right ones? How do we know that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John and the Acts of the Apostles and those letters actually truly reflect what Jesus said and what Jesus did? So we might want to go back in history and start examining and trying to find out Who is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? How did these Gospels come to be in the Bible? How did they come to be selected? How did they come to be chosen? How did this account of the life of Jesus come to us today? Now, it really gets very interesting when we start to examine and study that. One of the amazing things, and I discovered this relatively recently, is that all the original Gospels, that what we now call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were distributed anonymously, meaning the actual names Matthew and the name Mark and the name Luke and the name John were never on the documents, the old and ancient documents that we have. There was no name ascribed to them. The name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the names given to those Gospels, were actually attributed many, many years later. In fact, the earliest written statement that we have attributing authorship to the Gospels was as late as 300 years after the time of Jesus. So a man called Eusebius, who's one of the early Christian, when I say early, he was writing about 300 years after the time of Jesus. He claimed that another man called Irenaeus had said that this gospel was written by this person and this gospel was written by that person. But of course the writings of Irenaeus have not survived. And Irenaeus was writing about 125 years after the time of Jesus. So think about that. Think about that. That's like a bit like having the only copies of the American Declaration of Independence. Imagine that. The American Declaration of Independence, the only copies of it are 300 years later after the event. All we have in terms of manuscript evidence, and this is another point, in terms of actual manuscript evidence, the evidence is very sparse.
What a lot of rubbish. Come on, tell the truth to the people here.
What a load of rubbish, tell the truth to the people here. That's exactly what I'm doing. Okay? Okay. So, in fact, you know what? It doesn't matter. Because you know what? You can't make the blind see. You can't make the deaf hear. You can't. And people whose hearts they are dead, you can't bring them to life. Okay? So it's not our job really to make anyone believe anything. Our job is to present to people the facts. Believe me, I have absolutely no interest in telling one single lie. Not a single interest in telling a single lie. Absolutely not. Everything I have said so far can be proven historically. You can read what scholars have said, and these are not Muslim scholars. These are people who are non-Muslim, who attribute themselves to the Western Christian tradition. Of course, Christian fundamentalists would not call them Christians. But as we're going to see, the earliest fragments that exist of the actual gospel manuscripts are very small. I mean, they are a couple of lines. That's all we have. The largest sizable manuscript evidence that we have of the Gospels do not appear until over 100 years after the time of Jesus. There is a man called Constantine Tischendorf. He lived in the 19th century. It was his life's ambition to find the most ancient, complete biblical manuscript. This was his life's ambition. And he searched throughout the whole world to try and find the most ancient biblical manuscript.